I'll make a few considerations about the evolution of trust and transparency in the art market, mainly out of my experience locally in Brazil, because I think that's what interests everyone. Our earlier speakers did a great job of covering it overall, so restrict to the points that give me a hook to talk about something that's happening locally. And I'm quite self-conscious about the colors. When I bring a presentation from Brazil to London, it makes a difference. And I have to say, when I was invited to come and talk here, and I heard this trust and transparency, it wasn't really like me to be on the fence. I was trying to take one position on the other. And the way that the intellectual exercise they created for me to try and take one position or the other was to imagine if I was like in a horse race with two horses, one named after trust and one named after transparency, and was forced to sell my house to bet in one of them, what I would do. And I think I would go for trust. And so let's work through this together. So I wanted to start with a personal story because, as they said in the introduction, I do have 3 generations of artists in the family. So I could see from a very close perspective the changing status of what it meant to be an artist in these 3 generations. So in my grandfather's generation, like he was from the 1920s, so like the late 40s, he was already painting. He decided to be a professional painter when he was 16, and then. Then my father's generation, both my father and my uncle were artists, and like both professionals, and my uncle had like solos in museums, etc. So it was a good experience, like from the 50s. Then my brother's generation, with like today's, and we don't have time to do a full analysis. So I'll mention a few words, some vocabulary analysis that were used by them or to describe them. And I think you get the picture. So my grandfather, he was described as the communist, the self-taught painter, the painter of prostitutes who experimented with LSD, was eccentric, the political troublemaker. Was like he had problems with the military regime. Was a very I think you get the picture. Then in my father's generation, they were like described as charismatic party freaks. They are a little crazy, but still we could work with them. They were glamorous, and somebody once said they were like Rolling Stones, like whatever that means. And in my brother's generation, I'll get to the Brazilian market in a minute. In my brother's generation, like I go to openings, and especially now in Brazil, when we hear things like saying, well, they're going to be fine, they're strategic career-wise. And the others say, well, they're media savvy, they're watching Banksy, they know what to do. And they're diplomatic, they're working with scalable concepts, they can cope with the demands from the art fairs. And others say they're political, they'll be fine. And so we went through the full circle. Now the Brazilian art market, I've been in London from 2000 to 2012, and things changed a lot. When I had my gallery in Regent Street in 2003 and 4, and I said I was Brazilian, the usual answer was like, yes, I speak Spanish too, we can talk. And now Brazil is the special focus of the TEFAF report. We have a Sothebys exhibition next week in New York with 50 works by Brazilian artists, 16 artists. We have a market that was estimating $590 million, which I believe will grow many times over. We're the country to watch for dealers, collectors, art fund managers, curators. And so things went a great deal. Okay, so now we're like in the map, and that's definitely an evolution. And I think it can grow a lot, and some of the levers that can take us to this growth are the subject of our discussion today. And I did a little like structure, this introduction that's finishing, then we have pros and cons of trust, pros and cons of transparency, and a quick conclusion. And I'll start with trust, because I said I was going to bet on the trust horse. And so one thing in an emerging economy, I think we not always have the resources to do the legal contracts, the admin, and all that's required to do a deal that perhaps we would do in London in my time working in the secondary market here. So there, the trust allows us to save that time and go ahead with the deal. Also, the trust allows us to discern what to buy, and I'm talking perhaps now to a different angle on the trust on yourself. And I was representing a sale like of a painting that is in Europe and was like a $2 million painting, and I went to see a few collectors, and actually they could afford it. There are loads of people who can afford it in Brazil now, but they don't trust themselves because they haven't seen, they've never heard of Basilis, they've never heard of Kiefer. It's a different story, so it's one point there. Also, which is quite funny, Brazilians buy everything in installments, like anything, underwear, like chairs, electronics. And so if anyone has a gallery and you go to an art fair and people ask to pay in installments, and don't be offended. And I think that typically it's like 3 installments off the record, it can go up to 6 to anything. It's on a case-by-case basis. And I put it under trust because it can be so chaotic if you're like, we had an auction house in the family as well, and if you're selling hundreds of lots on loads of installments, just to keep a logging of it is almost impossible. You need to rely on trust. And also trust accelerate diligence. I think we've previous speakers talked about that, so I'll go quickly. Yeah, in which scenarios this trust that took us forward means a risk. And I'll continue betting on trust because some of the other benefits of trust will come later. So some risk of trust is that mistakenly buying art with no institutional endorsement. Like coming from London was mind-blowing to see how many artists have hundreds of records on sales of in excess of $10,000, and you go and you search them on Google and check their CV, they have no institutional endorsement whatsoever, no exhibitions in museums, great galleries, no reviews in magazines. And I was a shock, and I think I put in risk of trust because these people, I think they buy it thinking that there is such endorsement, and they don't realize that that's happening. And next, overpaying and buying into bubbles, and I'm heated up about this subject now because I'm just back from New York, and you see artists in their late 20s, early 30s who are selling for almost $500,000. And so if they're $500,000 at that stage of their career, where are they going? And so what are the references? And if there was more transparency about these bubbles, they wouldn't get into them. And critical confusion is something I notice. I don't know well about England, but I see in Germany, I see in France, you have some critics who are professional critics of other critics. And we don't see that in Brazil. So we go to an exhibition and we see a text in the entrance, we read the book, we just take it, and we trust that information is fine. We don't have anybody going in and criticizing them, as I recently read a book by a German on fakes, forgery, chandelier bidding. I think we covered that. So some questions. Could a speculative bubble be avoided if there was less trust? And maybe the answer is no, because in other industries we have more transparency and we still have a speculative bubble. But I thought I would launch the question. Why are people buying works by artists never shown in museums? I'm still trying to figure out. And actually I think that's a much bigger question, which I rephrase saying is like, what would stop ugly buildings being built in a city? I thought it's a much bigger issue of education of a whole society. Let's see if transparency can save us. So I think transparency can perhaps bring additional recognition to specialists. And we have qualified art advisors and the ones that were not. And in Brazil you see a lot of, with all respect, like the curators and architects, like advising them on making decisions on buying art. And if we have some transparency on who is who, I think perhaps it would be a more organized marketplace. Resale contracts, I thought I just put there, is something that is almost non-existent there. I don't know how the careers of these artists will be managed. It's something that any gallery you talk to in New York, when you were representing a buyer, they raise this. Family royalties, like I happen to inherit, for example, the royalties of my grandfather, and I can't enforce that. So there's a difference between law and practice. By law, we're entitled to 5% of this credit. In practice, if we do that, we'll be perceived by the community as greedy and will be ostracized. It's the culture there. Hopefully it's changing. Participation of international galleries raises standards of professionalism. So what we are seeing now with the art fairs, we had, I think it was 16, we had a high number of international galleries going to Art Rio, and we had a good number going to SAP Arte, and this is creating some competition to the local galleries and giving alternatives of reference of service, of art. Now some questions, would a side effect of this process be a threat of the local production dealers? So when Mr. Gagosian and J. Joplin, they land in town, is that going to intimidate the local dealers who are presenting the culture, the local culture? Let's look at some risks of this pristine transparency, as I'm still betting on trust, as art is a relationship business. Risk of transparency. So transparency can lead to corporativism of the art world. And so this is one of my key points here. So what about time for introspection, for shaping the concepts? And there was one of the artists that was like my grandfather's generation, who is definitely part of Brazilian history. And one day I went to his house, and he had a warehouse attached to his house that he never took anybody there. And he said, look, I'm going to make a special occasion, I'll show you something. And he showed me a painting he was working on for 7 years. So I guess this is completely out of question today. And so I wanted to raise that. Next. Algorithmic analysis of creativity by investment funds. If the market liked A, it will like B. Does inventiveness comes from pattern analysis or pattern disruption? And it's something I had an interest in a digital business once, and they were talking to me about this algorithm and how recommendation engines work. So like if you read 3 action books, the chance of you reading the 4th is higher. So they go and they recommend that. And I think maybe some funds or some investments are happening on that basis. And I'm wondering whether this is the way creativity happens. Is transparency fueling contemporary art inflated prices? Is that sustainable? I'll keep that as a question for the time's sake. Additional questions. Will the financiers, after messing up their world, think of 2008, will they come and mess up ours? And I'm very comfortable saying this because my business partner's into banking, they're into trading, and we had lots of conversations about this, and my association with them doesn't really say that, shows that I don't have anything against, but I think it's an important thought. So some conclusions: Brazilians are definitely grateful for this evolution of trust and transparency. We have local websites which are the equivalent of Art Price, or I don't know what we have in London, but in New York we have Art Cars, the lead lists all the events, and there we have Mapa das Artes, and the other one is called the Catálogo das Artes, which with the history of auction sales. And there are more artists living off their work than ever, and more galleries living off their gallery revenues than ever. That's great. But you should remain aware of market demands and algorithms. It stands for transparency through debate, not transparency that leads to lawyer-driven, money-driven transactions. And one of our solutions our company found to try and keep the balance was to create a society, and that's actually running in London. We are looking at duplicating that in São Paulo, but we have 500 members now, and the idea is to get people together, and as I did to myself in the beginning of the talk, of like a force to take a position, to encourage debate and critical thinking, and using high-end material as food for thought. So we take like the latest publications that we think are high quality, and we use that in those debates. And we believe that these two poles associated a good balance that we reach the market. We should remember that what transparency reveals and exposes often originates at its best in the lack of it. And I'm referring back to the example of my colleague, the artist who I talked about, who took 7 years to create a painting and became like a reference in Brazilian art history. Brazil is transforming, and transformation is fluid and malleable, as this is the nature of evolution itself. So this is a great thought that keeps me very optimistic. I think we're in evolution there, and this evolution is malleable. Is the time to go and step in. It's a perfect time for us to interfere and shape it before it settles, trying to protect the mysteries that lead to great art, and even construction investments. I have nothing against it, but I'm looking for this balance. And there's an opportunity for us all to assume a decisive role in this evolution of trust and transparency in Brazil. Thank you very much.